The restaurant was all glass, gold, and ego, the kind of place where people speak softly but wound deeply. From behind the corner wall, the laughter reached before the words did. Her husband, surrounded by friends, joked that their marriage was a charity case, that she could never match his world, that it was only a matter of time before he upgraded. They laughed like it was harmless. But humiliation has a way of clarifying the soul. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stepped forward, smiled, and agreed, right then and there, to end it. Hours later, alone with a suitcase and a silent phone, a message arrived from the last person she expected, and it changed the direction of her entire life. My name is Leona, I am 41 years old, and I once believed that love meant lowering your voice and raising your patience. Our marriage had always been painted in quiet tones, polite dinners, curated photos, surface-level calm. People said we were perfect together, and I clung to that sentence like a lifeline. I ignored the small dismissals, the subtle corrections, the way he introduced me as an accessory rather than a partner. I told myself success had simply made him distracted, not distant. I thought loyalty would eventually be rewarded. I didn't realize that while I was protecting the marriage, he was performing it for status, for image, for a world that applauded him while overlooking me entirely. When he invited me to a luxury dinner with his oldest friends, I thought it was progress. A sign I was finally being included instead of displayed. The restaurant shimmered, marble floors, glittering glassware, soft music humming like a secret. He kissed my cheek for show and guided me toward the table before excusing himself to take a call. I waited, watching the other wives compare jewelry and whispered vacations I'd never been invited to. Still, I smiled. I always smiled. I reminded myself to be grateful for the life we had. I didn't know that just beyond a thin wall, the truth of our marriage was being traded for cheap laughter. On my way to the restroom, their voices drifted toward me, low at first, then cruelly clear. I heard him laugh. Heard him say our marriage was a joke, that I was comfortable, not exceptional, that he'd trade up within a year. The table erupted. My world didn't shatter loudly, it cracked in silence. I stood there, frozen in heels that suddenly felt 2 sizes too small. Every sacrifice, every compromise, every quiet apology I made for his temper replayed in my mind. I realized with aching clarity that the man I loved didn't just undervalue me, he enjoyed announcing it. And in that moment, something inside me finally stopped begging to be seen. I walked back into the dining room with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. He smiled when he saw me, the polished, public smile. I matched it, standing beside him as the table fell silent. Then, just loud enough for them all to hear, I said we should stop pretending. If my presence was a joke, the punchline could end here. Let's divorce, I added lightly, as if suggesting dessert. His face was drained of color, a few forks clattered. No one laughed this time. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply returned my ring to the linen napkin and thanked them all for the evening. It was the calmest goodbye I'd ever spoken. I left the restaurant without looking back, my reflection ghosting through glass doors and polished floors. The night air felt colder than I expected, but also cleaner, like the first breath after a long illness. There were no dramatic tears, just a steady ache that wrapped itself around my ribs. A driver dropped me at a small hotel, where I booked a room with shaking hands and stared at my bare finger. For the first time in years, there was no one to shrink for, no one to impress, just silence and the terrifying, exhilarating truth that my life now belonged to me again. Morning came with a suitcase and a blank page. I moved into a modest apartment with thin walls and sunlight that spilled through the curtains like hope. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I made coffee without fear of criticism, wore clothes that felt like me, and let my thoughts stretch out after years of being folded small. The pain still sat beside me at breakfast, but it no longer dictated the day. I didn't know what came next. I only knew that I would never again accept love that required me to disappear to deserve it. That first week alone was quiet, until the night my phone lit up past midnight. The name on the screen startled me, his best friend, the same man who had been laughing at that dinner. My instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity won. His message wasn't mocking. It wasn't casual. It was cautious and apologetic. He said there were things I didn't know about my husband. Things hidden behind investment accounts, partnerships, and conversations he assumed I'd never hear. Then he added one line that made my heart pound. You deserve to see the full picture before he erases it. And suddenly, the end of my marriage felt less like a collapse and more like the beginning of a revelation. She agreed to meet him in a quiet cafe, half expecting another insult wrapped in politeness. Instead, he looked uneasy, almost guilty. He confessed that the dinner conversation had gone much further than she'd heard, that her husband had bragged about keeping assets hidden, moving money into private trusts, and making sure she'd walk away grateful for scraps. The friend said he couldn't stay silent anymore. He handed her a folder containing copies of emails, statements, and messages, proof she'd been intentionally sidelined. The shock didn't hit all at once. It seeped in slowly, replacing heartbreak with something steadier, clarity. The man she'd loved had not only mocked her, he had prepared to discard her. Back in her apartment, she spread the documents across the small kitchen table. Accounts she'd never heard of, transfers she'd never consented to, investments purchased in other names. It was a map, not of wealth, but of deception. The numbers weren't what hurt most. It was the realization that every affectionate gesture had been paired with a private safety plan for him alone. She felt foolish for trusting so completely, but that feeling soon hardened into resolve. If he thought she would leave quietly, he had underestimated the woman he'd dismissed as not on his level. For the first time, she began to see the power of knowing the truth. Instead of breaking her, the betrayal lit something inside her that had slept for years. She stopped replaying the dinner scene and started asking questions, legal, financial, strategic. She met with advisors, learned the language of contracts and equity, and gathered every document with meticulous care. Pain became a strange kind of fuel. Each new fact steadied her hands and sharpened her focus. She wasn't chasing revenge. She was claiming dignity, the piece of herself she'd almost abandoned. And with every step, the timid version of her faded, replaced by someone who finally understood that silence had never protected her. Action would. She realized she didn't just want fairness in divorce, she wanted independence. Real, unshakable independence. So she revisited an old dream she had once tucked away, starting a small business built around skills she'd quietly mastered for years. She reached out to mentors, joined workshops, and listened more than she spoke. The world felt overwhelming at first, but every new lesson stitched confidence back into her bones. She registered a company name, designed a simple logo, and launched with more courage than capital. What she lacked in money, she made up for in discipline and sincerity, and slowly momentum began to move in her favor. The early days were modest, late nights at the dining table, emails drafted and redrafted, meetings squeezed between legal consultations. She networked relentlessly, building relationships based on trust rather than image. Her first clients arrived cautiously, then returned with referrals. Income trickled in, then flowed a little steadier each month. She learned to celebrate small victories, a positive review, a signed contract, a repeat order. With every milestone, she loosened the remaining emotional threads that tied her to the man who once defined her worth. Independence didn't happen in a moment. It unfolded, gently but firmly, like dawn. Success never travels alone, struggle walks beside it. There were weeks when bills loomed, when mistakes proved costly, when doubt climbed into bed with her at night. She cried sometimes but never quit. She learned the hard way that growth demands discomfort, negotiations, rejections, and the courage to advocate for herself. Friends faded. New allies appeared. She grew thicker skin without hardening her heart. Each hardship became a lesson she refused to repeat. And through it all, she realized something powerful. She had been capable all along. She had simply been convinced she wasn't. Months passed. Her business no longer felt fragile. It felt steady, like ground beneath her feet. She woke each morning not to please someone else, but to build something that carried her name, her integrity, her story. Quiet determination settled in, replacing the old need for approval. She didn't announce her progress. She didn't chase recognition. She simply worked consistently, intelligently, patiently. And somewhere in the background, word of her success began to travel, including to the man who once boasted she'd never survive without him. His world was about to learn just how wrong he had been. She treated growth like a craft, not a race. Each day began with reading, note-taking, and mapping out small, achievable steps. She refined her services, improved her systems, and learned how to negotiate without apologizing for existing. Instead of shrinking when something felt new, she leaned toward it. She surrounded herself with people who valued integrity more than image. Her evenings were filled with quiet creativity, sketching ideas, improving processes, building a brand that reflected her values rather than someone else's ego. The life she was creating didn't happen by accident. It happened by intention, layer upon careful layer. And with every plan completed, confidence rooted itself a little deeper. Her first true breakthrough came unexpectedly. A major client found her through a simple recommendation. The initial meeting was daunting, but she arrived prepared, composed, and unafraid to state her worth. They chose her not because of flashy presentation, but because of competence and sincerity. The contract changed everything. It stabilized her finances, validated her vision, and opened doors she once believed were locked to people like her. She walked home that evening with a quiet smile, realizing success didn't need to be loud to be real. It could be steady, humble, and still powerful enough to rewrite an entire future. Success began attracting the right kind of people, mentors who offered guidance without condescension, partners who believed in collaboration rather than control. She learned to ask better questions, to delegate wisely, to value her time as much as her talent. Conversations no longer made her feel small. She had a seat at the table, one she'd carved out for herself. These allies didn't see her as a shadow behind a powerful man. They saw her as the engine of her own creation. And slowly, the ecosystem around her shifted from dependence to mutual respect. With structure and support in place, her business transformed from promising to established. Revenue grew, opportunities multiplied. She expanded carefully, refusing to compromise ethics for speed. There were still obstacles, there always are, but now she faced them with strategy, not fear. Her calendar is filled with meaningful work. Her home was filled with peace. Her heart filled with something she had forgotten existed, pride that didn't require anyone else's permission. She was no longer surviving. She was building, brick by brick, choice by choice. Confidence didn't return as arrogance. It returned as calm. She no longer rehearsed sentences in her head before speaking. She no longer feared disapproval. She carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who had walked through humiliation and emerged intact. She invested in herself, new courses, better tools, healthier routines. The mirror reflected not just a woman, but a journey. She had outgrown the version of herself that begged for validation. Now she simply honored her worth, and the world responded accordingly. Word eventually reached him, whispered through mutual friends, headlines, and industry circles. The woman he once mocked was now a name mentioned in meetings respectfully. His curiosity turned to unease when he realized she no longer revolved around his existence. He sent messages, polite at first, then nostalgic, then regretful. She replied rarely and only with formality. He had taught her how to live without him. Now he had to live with the result. Their paths finally crossed at a professional event. He expected the woman he once controlled. Instead, he met someone composed, self-assured, completely beyond his influence. Conversations hovered around her achievements, not his. The balance had shifted, not because she sought revenge, but because she reclaimed herself. He was left standing in the shadow of the future he once believed she didn't deserve. She walked away calmly, knowing power had never been about money or status. It had always been about self-respect, and she finally had it. He reached out again, this time without the polished confidence he once wore like a suit. His messages were longer now, reflective, hesitant, full of questions about how she'd been and whether they could talk properly. He suggested coffee, then dinner, then simply a walk. He spoke of memories, of mistakes, of the life they once shared. She read every word slowly, not out of longing, but out of caution. People don't change because apologies sound poetic. They change when truth reshapes them. Still, she agreed to meet, not for closure from him, but to confirm the closure she had already built inside herself. Seeing him again reopened memories she thought had settled into silence. The familiar voice, the subtle charm, the way he softened his tone when he wanted something, all of it returned with uncomfortable clarity. He spoke about stress, pressure, bad influences, anything that shifted blame away from the core truth. He had enjoyed humiliating her. Listening to him stirred old hurt, but it didn't control her anymore. Pain knocked on the door of her heart and found it locked. She realized healing doesn't erase the past. It simply removes its power to define the present. When he suggested that maybe they had both overreacted, something inside her straightened. The old version of herself might have apologized just to keep the peace. Not anymore. She spoke plainly about the dinner, the lies, the hidden accounts, the way he'd laughed at her existence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't tremble. She simply refused to make herself small to fit his comfort. For the first time, he had to sit with the full weight of his actions, without excuses, without distractions, without her cushioning the truth to protect his pride. She told him she had built a life without him, not as revenge, but as rebirth. She explained that real partnership doesn't require one person to disappear so the other can shine. He listened, but she could see the shock beneath his calm expression. He had assumed she would grieve forever, orbiting around the memory of him. Instead, she had outgrown the very world he once used to measure her worth. Saying the truth out loud felt like opening a window in a room that had been closed for years. Fresh air, no fear, just honesty. Eventually, the conversation slipped. The compliments faded and envy surfaced. He asked probing questions about her success, her income, her connections, curiosity tinted with resentment. The man who once mocked her ambition now seemed threatened by it. He hinted that perhaps they could rebuild together, as if her achievements were a prize he might reclaim by association. She saw through it instantly. His interest wasn't in love. It was in proximity to what she had created. And nothing revealed the truth faster than realizing he valued her more now that the world did too. She didn't lash out, she simply said no, gently, firmly, finally. No to rewinding the story, no to shrinking herself, no to pretending things had ever been equal. Closure didn't arrive as a dramatic farewell. It came as calm acceptance, the understanding that some chapters end not with anger but with clarity. He looked smaller somehow, not because he had changed physically, but because she no longer viewed him through the lens of longing. He was just a man. And she was no longer the woman willing to disappear for him. You may think the story ends here, but it doesn't. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with me. The twist is just ahead. Leaving that meeting, she felt lighter than she had the night she walked out of the restaurant. Back then, she was escaping. Now she was choosing. Her life stretched ahead: meaningful work, genuine relationships, quiet mornings without dread. She didn't need revenge. Success had already rewritten the story. And though he might always wonder how she became the woman he once said she could never be, that answer no longer belonged to him. It belonged to her, and to the future she had the courage to claim. Her life no longer moved at someone else's pace. She built her schedule around meaning instead of appearances, choosing projects that aligned with her values rather than ego. Mornings began with quiet gratitude. Evenings ended with genuine peace. She didn't chase validation anymore, opportunities now came to her. People respected her boundaries because she respected them first. Independence didn't make her lonely, it made her whole. For the first time, she wasn't surviving inside someone else's shadow. She was living in her own sunlight, and it felt steady, earned, and completely hers. Eventually, apologies faded, replaced by consistent respect, not just from him, but from anyone who crossed her path. She carried herself differently now, and others responded to the unspoken standard she set. Conversations were balanced, partnerships were mutual. No one expected her to shrink, and she never offered to. Respect became the quiet language of her life, not demanded, simply mirrored. She realized that apologies are temporary, but changed behavior is permanent. And now, everywhere she went, she encountered the latter more than the former. The past still existed, but it no longer reached into her present to grab at her confidence. Those painful scenes became lessons instead of wounds. She could talk about them without shaking, remember them without collapsing. Healing hadn't erased history, it had rewritten its meaning. Instead of seeing herself as the woman who'd been mocked, she saw herself as the woman who walked away. And the difference between those two identities was everything. One evening, the man who had first sent the late-night message reached out again, not with secrets this time, but with gratitude. He told her that seeing her choose dignity had changed how he lived his own life. He had ended dishonest partnerships, rebuilt his integrity, and wanted to invest, not in her success, but in her vision. It wasn't romantic, it was respectful. For once, a man entered her world without trying to own it. She agreed carefully, confidently, because she now trusted her instincts more than anyone else's promises. Their partnership grew slowly, built on transparency, humor, and mutual admiration. They challenged each other, not to control, but to grow. She was never asked to dim her light. In fact, she was encouraged to let it blaze brighter. Together, they created something meaningful, a company that valued people over profit, honesty over show. And whether or not love ever blossomed, one truth already had: partnership only works when both people stand tall. Peace doesn't mean silence anymore. It meant alignment, knowing she could walk away from anything that cost her self-respect. Money no longer frightened her. Loneliness no longer haunted her. She had built a life that worked even if no one stayed, and that security felt better than any luxury ever had. She could choose connection freely now, not out of fear, but out of abundance. Standing on a balcony overlooking the city she once felt invisible in, she smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because she finally had enough for herself. The man who mocked her marriage had become a distant echo. The woman who walked away had become a testament to courage. And the future stretching ahead wasn't defined by envy, apology, or revenge, only by self-worth, purpose, and the quiet strength of someone who finally chose her own life and never looked back.